The system did not collapse under pressure. It continued operating exactly as designed. Inputs were logged, decisions were routed, approvals were recorded, escalations occurred on schedule. Nothing failed in a way the system could recognize. What failed was responsiveness. Responsiveness was never a track variable. The controls existed to prevent deviation, not to interpret novelty. They were built to neutralize variance, not to understand it. From the outside, the organization appeared calm, predictable, procedurally intact. Meetings continued, reports circulated, compliance metrics held. There was no visible alarm, no rupture later cited as the beginning. Inside, a gap formed between reality and recognition, not because anyone ignored what was happening, because no mechanism existed to acknowledge it without violating protocol. This was not negligence. It was fidelity. Years earlier, the system had been redesigned after a different failure. That earlier failure was rooted in speed. Decisions had moved too quickly. Authority had been exercised informally. Outcomes were achieved without documentation. When those outcomes were later questioned, no record existed to defend them. The response was methodical. Approval layers were added. Decision rights were codified. Escalation paths were formalized with time-based triggers. Every action became legible. Every deviation became auditable. An internal memo from that restructuring period, never released externally, contained a sentence that quietly shaped behavior. Discretion will be treated as a liability until proven otherwise. It was not framed as a warning, it was framed as risk management. At the time the redesign worked, risk incidents declined, variance narrowed, external auditors expressed confidence. The organization gained legitimacy by appearing controlled. Because nothing visibly broke, the architecture was preserved, then elevated from procedure to identity. The system no longer governed behavior. It defined what responsible behavior was. The first signs of strain did not arrive dramatically. They arrived as minor irregularities, requests that did not fit existing categories, operational anomalies that crossed departments without triggering ownership, market responses that were directionally clear but procedurally ambiguous. Each signal alone was dismissible. Together they described a pattern. Patterns were not actionable unless formally recognized. Recognition required consensus. Consensus required alignment across functions with no incentive to agree. Escalation required justification. Justification required precedent. Precedent required similarity. None existed. One regional director attempted to respond informally. He convened an off-calendar meeting across 3 departments. No agenda circulated, no minutes were taken. The meeting was later flagged, not for its conclusions, but for its format. It did not conform to governance standards. The insight never entered the system. As conditions continued to shift, requests for exceptions increased. They were logged as process education gaps. Escalations rose and were interpreted as training deficiencies rather than signal failure. Time to decision lengthened. Dashboards framed this as diligence, not paralysis. Every symptom had a category. None of the categories allowed the system itself to be questioned. A quiet internal review, never broadly circulated, used the phrase procedural saturation in a footnote. The term did not align with existing risk language. It was not adopted. To acknowledge saturation would have implied that control had become extractive rather than protective. That framing did not advance. Instead, the system doubled down on clarity. Decision trees were refined. Approval matrices were redrawn. New documentation templates were introduced to reduce friction. Friction did not decrease. It became harder to locate. Managers adapted again, but this time without authority. Workarounds multiplied quietly. Parallel processes emerged without recognition. Shadow coordination replaced sanction judgment. Discretion was eliminated at the top and reintroduced at the edges, where it was least visible and least accountable. By the time leadership became aware, the organization no longer operated as a single system. It functioned as overlapping fragments, each compliant in isolation, incoherent in aggregate. Metrics remained stable because metrics tracked adherence, not coherence. Audits passed because audits measured documentation, not synthesis. Nothing inside the system indicated crisis. The first undeniable signal arrived externally. A counterpart organization responded faster, not because it was better governed, because it was less certain. Its controls were weaker, its documentation thinner, its authority messier. It acted without full consensus and absorbed the cost internally. Internally, the explanation was defensive. The other organization had taken irresponsible risk. It had bypassed safeguards. It would pay for it later. None of those statements were false. What they obscured was timing. The cost the other organization accepted immediately was visible. The cost this system deferred was structural. This decision architecture cannot be transferred forward. The environment that made it effective no longer exists. Timing, scale, and signal density have shifted beyond what layered authorization can absorb. Imitation fails not because the logic is flawed, but because the sequence no longer holds. This is where Machiavelli becomes insufficient. He warned that rigidity invites failure. Assuming rigidity emerges from fear or incompetence. Modern control systems are neither. They are rational. They are defensible. They are often ethical by design. Their failure is not moral, it is temporal. Authority is exercised only after reality stabilizes enough to be categorized. Modern environments no longer grant that pause. By the time classification occurs, consequence has already settled. The system does not misjudge reality. It arrives late to it. From inside the organization, this delay does not feel like delay. Each decision occurs on time. Each approval arrives within its allotted window. The system experiences itself as efficient. What it cannot perceive, the file is closed, not because the issue is resolved, but because the system cannot register unresolved states.